The night Harry Nilsson finally broke his voice, he was standing in the place he loved most and feared the least, a recording studio. Outside, Los Angeles was doing what it always did. Neon bleeding into smog, taxis nosing past billboards, the city humming its sleepless, indifferent tune. Inside the room, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and bad coffee, empty bottles and too many jokes that weren't really jokes. John Lennon was there, hair shaggy, eyes bright with mischief and exhaustion. Ringo Starr drifted in and out. Musicians lounged on amps and folding chairs, waiting for the red light above the control room door to blink. The album was called Pussycats. Lennon was producing. For Nilsson, this should have been the dream. His favorite Beatles steering his ship, his name on the spine of the record, his voice poured across the tape in layer after layer. Somewhere, a kid in Brooklyn who once worked graveyard shifts at a bank just to keep the lights on would have killed for this moment. Now that he had it, he looked like a man about to jump off a cliff. The take begins like so many others. Nilsson steps into the vocal booth, headphones clamped around his ears, eyes half closed. The track swells in his head, drums, guitars, a piano somewhere in the murk. He leans into the microphone, testing the first line with that old, familiar control. Then the self-destructive part of his brain whispers, "Louder." One more push. Make it rougher, rawer. Something Lennon can't get from anyone else. He obliges. He starts to scream. Not a metal scream, not a punk howl, but a desperate, rasping attempt to tear feelings straight out of his chest and smear it over the song. Lennon eggs him on from the other side of the glass. The band whoops. Nilsson pushes harder. The sound distorts, frays, splinters. Somewhere deep in his throat, a small, crucial piece of tissue gives way. For a beat, he feels nothing but adrenaline. Then the metallic taste hits. He coughs into his hand and sees blood. His eyes flick to the window. Lennon is laughing, clapping, shouting something like, "That's it, Harry, that's it." The band is buzzing. The take crackles with a kind of chaotic genius only disaster can produce. Nilsson swallows the taste of iron and fear. "My voice was a gift," he would say later, "and sometimes a curse." The doctor he visits shortly afterward is not laughing. He peers into Nilsson's throat and delivers a sentence like a court ruling. No talking for 2 weeks. No singing. Total vocal rest. If you disobey, you might lose the thing that made you special forever. Nilsson walks out of the office with a prescription and a stack of notepads to communicate in scribbles. His friends, including Lennon, try to be supportive. They joke. They pass notes back and forth like school kids. But when the studio calls again, the pull is too strong. Nilsson goes back to the microphone. He sings anyway. He tears the wound wider, track by track, until the golden tenor that once floated like McCartney's turns into something rougher, scarred, permanently changed. On paper, Pussycats is a coup. John Lennon producing an American singer-songwriter the Beatles once called their favorite. In reality, it is a crime scene, the sound of a man pushing his only true instrument past the point of repair while the world watches through the glass and tries to decide whether this is art or just self-destruction. "I never liked performing," Nilsson would insist. "I only liked creating." That was the paradox at the center of Harry Nilsson. He wasn't built for the stage, the spotlight, the roar of crowds demanding an encore. He was built for the studio at 3 in the morning, eyes red, mind racing, stacking his own voice into choirs no one else could hear yet. He was a genius who didn't want to be looked at, only listened to. A man who could write the perfect pop song and then vanish before anyone could clap. To understand how that shy, strange kid became the singer who could rip his own voice apart in front of John Lennon rather than say, "Stop," we have to go back to where it started. A broken family, a nighttime bank job, and a boy teaching himself music in the leftover hours. Harry Edward Nilsson III was born in Brooklyn in 1941, into a life that started with absence. His father drifted away early, another American ghost leaving behind a name, a few stories, and a hole that never really closed. The mythology around Papa Nilsson changed depending on who told it. A sailor, a musician, a charmer who left one day and never quite came back. For young Harry, the details mattered less than the shape of the loss. There was a senior and a junior, and then a silence where Dad was supposed to be. His mother moved the family to Southern California, chasing stability, sunshine, anything better than what they had. They landed in modest apartments in neighborhoods where the rent was low and the turnover high. Money was scarce. Responsibility wasn't. Nilsson took jobs early, sweeping floors, tearing tickets at movie theaters, running errands, anything to help keep the lights on. Eventually, he landed a job in the computer department of a bank in Van Nuys. It sounded glamorous on paper. Computers were the future, after all. In reality, it was midnight fluorescence and the hum of early mainframes feeding stacks of punch cards into machines that spoke only in numbers. His shift was overnight. While most of Los Angeles slept, he sat under buzzing lights, reconciling accounts, watching columns of figures line up neatly on green and white paper. Daylight was for music. When his shift ended at 1 or 2 in the morning, he didn't go straight home. He dragged his exhausted body and wired brain to a borrowed office one publisher had let him use, a place with a piano, a couch, and a door that locked. He wrote songs there in that limbo between night and day, fingers finding chords while the rest of the city yawned awake. Some of his earliest gems, 1941, a crooked waltz about a father leaving. Without her, a fragile bossa nova of absence, were born in that double life, numbers and ledgers on one side, melodies and heartbreak on the other. He'd catch an hour or two of sleep slumped in a chair, then spend the day visiting music publishers, demo tapes in hand, trying to sell the songs he'd just written. The pattern was brutal. Work, write, hustle, repeat. But slowly, it worked. He began to get cuts. Cuddly Toy found its way to the Monkees. One became a hit for Three Dog Night. His name was tiny in the credits, if it appeared at all, but people inside the business started to whisper it. Nilsson wasn't classically trained. He didn't grow up devouring music theory textbooks. He taught himself by listening, by feel, by relentless curiosity. His mind ran in 1,000 directions at once. Cartoons, math, absurd jokes, tiny melodic hooks, and songs became the place where all those threads could braid together. He loved films, especially anything animated or off-kilter. He loved comic books and oddball humor. In conversation, he could shift from a bawdy story to a deep dive on chord inversions without warning, leaving people wondering which Harry they were talking to. The clown, the craftsman, or the wounded kid who still measured his worth in other people's reactions. "I wasn't meant for the spotlight," he would say later. "I was meant for the song." In a different era, he might have remained a professional ghost, a name on royalty statements, a writer who let others do the singing and the touring. But the 1960s were porous. The barriers between writer and singer, between behind the scenes and center stage, were starting to crumble. So when RCA signed him in 1967, they weren't just buying his songs, they were betting on that voice. Pandemonium Shadow Show didn't burn up the charts, but it did something more important. It impressed the right ears. Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer, fell in love with the record. He bought boxes of it and mailed copies to his famous friends like a man smuggling proof of a miracle. Eventually, the album landed on a turntable that mattered more than any radio playlist. Somewhere in London, John Lennon and Paul McCartney dropped the needle on Harry Nilsson. Lennon, asked soon after to name his favorite American artist, gave a one-word answer: Nilsson. When a journalist asked McCartney to name his favorite American group, he echoed the punchline: Nilsson. It was half joke, half benediction. An American songwriter who barely performed live, who still thought of himself as a bank clerk with a side hustle, had just been knighted by the most famous band on the planet. "Nilsson is the only guy American enough to blow my mind," Lennon supposedly said. Whether the quote is exact or embellished hardly matters. The sentiment was real. For a man who'd grown up listening to British bands saving American rock and roll, that kind of praise bent the universe. When the news reached Nilsson, he didn't strut. He panicked a little. The Beatles' praise kicked open doors, meeting them in person, flying to London, stepping into their orbit. But it also triggered a deep, familiar question. What if I'm not actually that good? What if they're wrong? He went to London. He hung out at Apple. Lennon and he bonded over dark humor, shared trauma, mutual awe. Here was a Beatle who for once wasn't performing for him, who treated him like an equal. That meant everything. It also meant the bar had just been raised to an almost impossible height. Back in the States, his own career began to warp under that new gravity. His cover of Fred Neil's "Everybody's Talkin'," recorded almost as an afterthought, was picked up for the film Midnight Cowboy. The movie's bleak, beautiful story of two lost men in New York needed a soundtrack that sounded like drifting, like watching your own life from a distance. Nilsson's voice, clear, lonely, a little amused by how badly everything was going, fit perfectly. The song became a hit, the film became a classic, and suddenly Harry Nilsson was more than a name on publishing contracts. He was the voice you heard when the credits rolled. He still didn't tour. There's a story that he did an early live gig somewhere small and it went badly. The monitors were off, the band loose. His voice refused to do what it did so easily in a studio. Audiences can forgive a lot. Nilsson's perfectionist brain couldn't. The sting of that night settled deep, and according to those who knew him, it fed a stage fright that never fully left. He saw what had happened to the Beatles when they had tried to be everywhere at once, screaming fans, no privacy, the whole world watching every slip. If he could have the songs without the madness, the records without the road, wasn't that a better deal? "I never liked performing," he explained. "I only liked creating." The creation reached its peak in 1971 with Nilsson Schmilsson. Working with producer Richard Perry, he pushed himself into bolder, more commercial territory without losing his odd edges. The record opens with "Gotta Get Up," a jaunty piano-driven track about trying and failing to start the day right, sung with such bounce you almost miss the anxiety underneath. The narrator is trapped in a loop of oversleeping, obligation, and quiet dread. Decades later, that song would loop relentlessly through the Netflix series Russian Doll, turning into a kind of existential alarm clock for a new generation who had never heard his name but suddenly couldn't escape his sound. Then there was "Without You." The song wasn't his. It was written by Pete Ham and Tom Evans of Badfinger, a band signed heartbreakingly to the Beatles' Apple label. Nilsson first heard it at a party and shrugged. He supposedly said, "I thought it was awful." In the studio, though, something shifted. Sitting at the piano, trying it out, he found a way into the melody that made sense. His version stripped away some of the original structure and let the chorus swell into something operatic, almost hysterical. The recording session for "Without You" was all about restraint and explosion. Strings arranged with almost syrupy drama threatened to drown the song. Nilsson's voice is the knife that cuts through the sugar. On the verses, he sings like a man trying very hard to keep his composure. On the choruses, he lets it crack just enough to sound like someone standing at the edge of a very real ledge. "I can't live if living is without you." He hits the high notes with terrifying ease, hangs on them just long enough to show you he can, then drops back down into that warm mid-range as if nothing happened. It's a stunt and a confession at the same time. You can almost hear, behind the lushness, a lonely man in a small office singing to nobody. The world responded. "Without You" topped the charts in both the US and UK, and Nilsson took home a Grammy for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance. Time magazine put his face on the cover, crowning him one of the voices of the era. He still didn't tour. Around this time, another project revealed as much about him as any hit song. The Point. On the surface, it was a whimsical animated TV special about a boy named Oblio, the only round-headed child in a village of pointy heads, who is banished because he doesn't literally fit. The soundtrack, written and performed by Nilsson, is full of gentle, sly songs that sound like lullabies and smuggle in existential questions. Beneath the child-friendly style, it is hard not to see the point. As autobiography. Nilsson was the odd shape in an industry of sharp angles, the studio hermit in a culture that demanded road warriors. He was Oblio, wandering through a forest of arbitrary rules, trying to figure out if there was any place for someone built the way he was. "I wasn't meant for the spotlight," he kept saying. "I was meant for the song." Then the 1970s, always a decade of extremes, turned darker. After the Beatles split, Lennon's life veered into what he called his lost weekend. He moved in circles of Hollywood decadence, drinking, drugs, chaos. Harry Nilsson, the Beatles' favorite American, was right there with him. The Troubadour incident, where Lennon and Nilsson were thrown out for drunkenly heckling the Smothers Brothers, became rock lore. To some it was funny, two famous guys misbehaving. To others it was frightening. Lennon looked out of control. Nilsson looked like a man who had found in Lennon a mirror for his own worst instincts. Behind the scenes there were tender moments too. Late-night conversations about fear, about fame, about the ridiculousness of their lives. But the headlines and the hangovers told their own story. Two gifted men trying to drink holes big enough in reality to escape their pain. The Pussycat sessions were the apex or the nadir of that period. Hazy nights, substance-fueled bravado, creative brilliance, and personal recklessness knotted together. Engineers later said it was painful to watch Nilsson shred the very voice that had made him famous. He hid the doctor's warnings from Lennon, not wanting to be seen as weak, not wanting to lose the opportunity. The masculine myth of rock and roll, that real artists sacrifice their bodies on the altar of authenticity, whispered seductively in his ear. He listened. After Pussycats, nothing was quite the same. He still wrote, he still recorded. Sometimes, as on Nilsson in 1977, the old magic flared up in new, rougher forms. But you can hear the change. The tenor is now a baritone. The notes that once glided now scrape. In some songs, the damage gives him a new kind of authority, like a once choir boy who has lived through the war. In others, especially on Sandman and Do It on Monday, you can hear the strain, the frustration, the echo of what he used to be. As if that weren't enough, there was Curzon Place. Nilsson's London flat at 9 Curzon Place, Mayfair, was supposed to be a glamorous base, a place where friends could crash, where he could be near the center of British music and still retreat behind thick walls. In 1974, Cass Elliot, Mama Cass of the Mamas and the Papas, died there after a solo show in London. 4 years later, in the very same apartment, The Who's drummer Keith Moon died. Two vibrant, troubled musicians, both gone at 32, in the same borrowed bedroom. Nilsson was devastated. He had not been present for either death, but they happened in his space, under his roofline. The flat began to feel cursed. He sold it. Some keys are too heavy to keep on a ring. The late 1970s and early 1980s found him drifting. He made the soundtrack for Robert Altman's Popeye, a strange, ambitious, uneven film that critics and audiences weren't sure what to do with. He acted briefly in Son of Dracula, a rock horror oddity that felt like a stoned-in joke stretched too far. He wrote songs for others, did session vocals, dabbled. None of it recaptured the impact of Nilsson Schmilsson or Without You, and he knew it. Then on December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed outside the Dakota in New York City. For Nilsson, it was a shattering. Lennon wasn't just a hero or a collaborator. He was a friend, a man he'd drunk with, laughed with, made terrible and glorious music with. The idea that someone could walk up and erase that person with a handgun was intolerable. He did something uncharacteristic. He stepped into public advocacy. He called the National Coalition to ban handguns in Washington, D.C., and asked how he could help. He lent his name, his time, and his money to gun control campaigns, becoming a spokesperson and organizer, appearing at rallies, including one in Hawaii pushing for strict handgun bans. He did interviews not about albums but about bullet calibers and background checks. The same man who had once hidden behind studio glass was now standing at podiums, visibly nervous and determined. He put his own musical career partly on hold. Interviews from the period show a man torn between grief and duty, trying to turn personal loss into public change. He couldn't save Lennon. Maybe he could help prevent some future Lennon from dying in front of some other building. I said to Ringo one night just after the shooting, "If I could take this from you, I would. But I can't," he recalled. "I was helpless, and that was the worst time in the world for me." The 1980s were a strange mix of activism, family life, and business complications. He remarried, found relative stability with his third wife, Una O'Keeffe, and became a full-time father, doting and chaotic, filling the house with kids and cartoons and music that wasn't always his own. Friends say he was happiest then in small domestic moments, making breakfast, telling stories, being a clown at the dinner table, rather than in any studio or industry office. On paper, he was still wealthy. At his peak, Nilsson had signed a record deal worth millions, a huge sum at the time. He had publishing income, performance royalties, investments. But the music business is full of traps that look like opportunities. In the early 1990s, Nilsson discovered that his financial manager had been stealing from him, bleeding his accounts for years. The man eventually served prison time for theft from multiple clients, but by then the damage to Nilsson's finances was deep. Once again, he did what he knew how to do when the world tilted. He went back to the songs. He pressed RCA to release an expansive box set of his work, to assert his place in the canon and to generate income. At the same time, he began working with producer Mark Hudson on new material, demoing tracks for a comeback record jokingly titled "Papa's Got a Brown New Robe." His voice was rough and worn, but there was still something alive in it, a kind of weather-beaten warmth that fit his age and history. The demos that survive show a man who has stopped trying to sound like his younger self and started leaning into the cracks. Then his heart gave out. On Valentine's Day, 1993, Nilsson suffered a major heart attack. He survived, barely. In hospital, he told visitors he wasn't done. He wanted to finish the album, secure his family's future, close his story on his own terms. And then, improbably, he did something almost nobody expected. On September 4th, 1992, before the heart attack but already in the shadow of health and money worries, Ringo Starr's all-star band was playing at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. Ringo announced a special guest. To be a member of this band, you have to have had a hit sometime this century. And Nilsson had probably the biggest, most beautiful hit of the 70s, Without You. Harry Nilsson walked on stage. For a man who almost never performed live, who had built a career on the refusal to tour, this was like watching a ghost step into daylight. He sang Without You in public for the first and only time. The video is grainy, the sound imperfect, but the moment is undeniable. Nilsson, heavier now, older, voice roughened and frayed, stands at the microphone while Todd Rundgren helps with the high notes. He doesn't try to pretend that 1971 never ended. He leans into the gravel, lets the years show. The audience, many of whom had probably never imagined they would see him in person, respond with something like awe. When the song ends, Ringo hugs him. It looks emotional, and not just for the crowd. It's as if for one night Nilsson stepped out of the studio shadows and allowed himself to be seen. To accept, however briefly, that his place in people's lives existed not only on vinyl, but in the shared air of a room. Then the lights went down, the tour moved on, and Harry returned to what he knew. family, unfinished tapes, a body that kept reminding him of its limits. On January 15, 1994, Harry Nilsson died of heart failure in his home in Agoura Hills, California. He was 52. The news flickered across newspapers and TV anchors' scripts. Singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson, best known for Without You and Everybody's Talkin', has died. For younger listeners, it was a footnote. For those who had lived through the 1970s with his records on their shelves, it was another confirmation that the era itself was receding, its voices dropping away one by one. The documentary Who is Harry Nilsson and Why is Everybody Talking About Him, released years later, would pose the question many had quietly felt. Who was this man who wrote hits for others, sang a few defining songs of his generation, drank with Lennon, ruined his own voice, fought gun violence, loved cartoons, and then slipped into relative obscurity? The answers depend on where you look. To some, Harry Nilsson is forever the man of Without You. Eyes closed, veins in his neck straining as he sings like he has nothing left to lose. To others, he is the airy, almost conversational voice of Everybody's Talkin', gliding over images of a lost hustler in New York. To songwriter geeks, he's the architect of One, Don't Forget Me, Gotta Get Up, 1941, songs that twist when you expect them to resolve, that sneak complex harmonies under disarmingly simple melodies. Listen to Don't Forget Me, his farewell to a lover who is already halfway out the door. The chord changes lurch in unexpected directions, but his vocal sits calmly at the center, like a man trying not to show how scared he is. Listen to Jump Into the Fire, a grinding rock track where he yells over a bass line that sounds like a nervous breakdown. These aren't just genre exercises, they're weather reports from inside one very specific, very restless brain. To his friends, he was something more contradictory. A prankster, a depressive, a genius, a child in a man's body, a man who could talk for hours about cartoons and then suddenly drop a line so piercing you'd think about it for weeks. My voice was a gift, he said, and sometimes a curse. I wasn't meant for the spotlight, he added. I was meant for the song. In the long shadow of his career, there's a growing awareness that Nilsson helped invent a new kind of artist. The studio hermit whose true stage is the control room, whose real performances take place between tape heads and mixing boards, not under amphitheater lights. Modern singer-songwriters who despise touring but obsess over arrangements, who build albums like intricate puzzles only they fully understand, are following a map he drew almost accidentally. His influence surfaces in odd places. Rufus Wainwright's Baroque pop, Fiona Apple's fearless emotional contortions, even Harry Styles' willingness to swing between earnest ballads and tongue-in-cheek curiosity, all of them operate in a world where Harry Nilsson already proved that a pop record could be both weird and commercially sharp, both deeply personal and shamelessly crafted. His story sits in a crooked constellation of other solitary geniuses. There are echoes of Brian Wilson, another studio-bound architect whose mind sometimes felt too delicate for the world outside the control room. You can see dark parallels with Elliott Smith, whose inner battles seeped into meticulously crafted songs, or Amy Winehouse, whose once-in-a-generation voice buckled under the weight of expectation and addiction. The details differ. The pattern, the tug-of-war between gift and self-destruction, is uncomfortably familiar. Harry Nilsson's version of that pattern is quieter. There's no stadium meltdown, no live TV collapse, no tabloid photo of a ruined show. His implosions happened in small rooms, a studio booth at 3 a.m, a bank office at dawn, a rented flat where 2 friends died without him. He didn't give the world a spectacular crash to gawk at. He just slowly, stubbornly chose the song over the spotlight, even when that choice left him broke, hoarse, and misunderstood. He hid in plain sight, inside the grooves. He used his songs as masks, as confessionals, as shields. People heard the melodies, the jokes, the high notes, the sad ones. They didn't always hear the man who felt safer talking to tape than to a crowd. People hear the songs, he said. They don't hear the loneliness behind them. That loneliness is still in there if you listen closely. In the small pauses between lines, in the way a chorus feels slightly too big for the room, in the sense that for all its warmth, his voice is singing from a long distance away. We remember the genius. We sometimes forget the cost. So maybe the real questions at the end of this story aren't about whether Harry Nilsson deserved more fame, more money, more safety. Maybe they're about us. What do we owe the artists whose songs knit our lives together while their own lives quietly come apart off stage? And if a man spends his whole career insisting he was meant for the song, not the spotlight, do we honor him best by dragging him into the light, or by listening a little closer to the echoes he left behind?